Welcome to the free class for Tisha B'Av. Shouldn't Tisha B'Av be a holiday? I'm going to explain the title because I was having some conversations with people about trying to come up with a topic. I usually do a free virtual tour on Tisha B'Av every year. I've been doing it for the past 4 years. This one is not a virtual tour. This one is a class. So it's kind of like a more conceptual, direct discussion as opposed to doing it through a virtual tour. So I do that as well, but it's not my usual thing. It's usually virtual tours. And somebody was saying to me that so many people want to have a discussion about current events, what happened since Simchat Torah, October 7th, and the whole the World War III kind of situation we seem to be in, and what is going on, and why on Tisha B'Av, and can we make Tisha B'Av more meaningful than just remembering something about the temple? Can it be about what's going on under current events? Like, shouldn't it be like some kind of holiday, like a sad holiday or something like that, to deal with current events? So that's what sparked this this title, which is Shouldn't Tisha B'Av be a holiday, and why it's not about sinat chinam, about baseless hatred, and how it's relevant to today. So this is basically the stories that we're going to engage in, and the way I'm going to engage in this conversation, not through the analysis of the Middle East and studies of Islam and all. I'm not going in that direction at all. I'm not even going to start analyzing and pointing fingers at who's responsible for being asleep at the wheel during the attack. What I would like to do through this conversation is to try to see what's the underlying root of the issue. What are the questions that we need to ask ourselves so that we could get ourselves out of this difficult situation, which is not just this current situation, but it's kind of an historic continuum of many tragedies that have led to where we are today. So that's the premise. That's how I'm going to begin. What exactly happens on Tisha B'Av? Let's first start with that. So on this day, we have a lot of different historic events. We have one that's in Tanakh, in the Torah. We have a tradition that the sin of the spies, the Chet HaMeraglim, happened on this day. The destruction of the first temple happened on this day. The destruction of the second temple happened on this day. And the expulsion from Spain happened on this day. And there's a whole lot of other things that took place on this very day that we attribute them, we connect them. So if you read the Kinot, the Lamentations that we read today, depending where you are in the world, but which we read this morning in Israel, there's, for example, the burning of the Talmud in 1244 in Paris, or the Crusades in the 1090s and 1100s, right, where the communities of Shpira, Magenza, Vermaisa in the Rhineland were obliterated, right? So many different things. And then, of course, we add the Holocaust to that, which is a fairly recent development, because there have been times in which the Holocaust is still in Israel. The Holocaust stands on its own. There's a Holocaust Memorial Day, but it's also seen more recently in the past decades as being integral to the bigger picture of tragedy in Jewish history, which is Tisha B'Av. So that's something that in traditional Jewish thought we sort of take for granted, that it's connected, because we see that all of the events that took place on Tisha B'Av have some kind of thread that runs through them. And this is where I'd like to introduce the concept of a holiday, but holiday not as a happy festive day. Now, we have a lot of holidays in the Jewish year. Some are biblical, some are not, some are more recent, like Yom HaAtzmaut, Yom HaZikaron. There's a lot of contemporary holidays and discussions about a day that deals, for example, with October 7, which was really on Simchat Torah, which is a more appropriate day to say how does it relate to the Jewish holiday as opposed to the let's say arbitrary Gregorian calendar. But okay, that's a separate conversation. In the holidays, we have a few holidays which are called Moadim, which is part of the prayer. We say Moadim uzmanim lesason. We say Moed is a set aside time in which we usually we would say celebrate something. So the three basic Moadim are Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot. And I'm going to discuss this for a few minutes because it's the foundation for continuing this conversation. So forgive me for just about 5 minutes or so. We're going to talk about the concept of Moed, okay? So in the Jewish calendar, which is, of course, an integral part of our lives for thousands of years, there's this concept of Moed. The literal translation of Moed means a set time. Like we say, something is mu'ad le. Something is set aside for something. So Moed is also mean, like, for example, when the angel tells Sarah Imenu, that she's going to be pregnant and have a child in 1 year from today, which we read on Rosh Hashanah. It says LaMoed ashuv elecha ke'et chaya u'lesara ben. In this time, in just in 1 year from now, there's going to be a set time. I'm going to come back, or Sarah's going to have a child in a year from now. So Moed means a set time. And in terms of the Jewish calendar, the way that we look at this traditionally is that there are certain set times in the year in which you meet with, which is what Moed means, you meet with a certain concept, an idea that expresses itself in the world, and we engage with it. So in a very simple term, the spring. The spring is a festival of freedom. It's springtime. Everything is blossoming. Everything is beautiful. We left Egypt. We became a nation. We celebrate that. It's an agricultural holiday, and we connect it to a historic event. That is a time in which we meet with, the Moed that we meet with is our freedom. That's it. The same thing we can say about Shavuot, which is the harvest festival for wheat, and it's a time in which we receive the Torah. It's a time of accepting Torah. Fine. Then we have Sukkot, which is a time of the end of the year, the dying of the year, the Tkufat Hashanah, the Asif. It's when everything is being gathered into the house and you're getting ready for the winter. And you live out traditionally in the times of, biblical times, you'd live in some kind of hut in a sukkah out in nature, watching over your crops and collecting everything. And we connect that to the clouds of glory and Anei Kavod as sort of a kind of sukkah, God's protection in the wilderness. And we tie the two together. It's in essence, it's a time of joy and celebration because we're celebrating the final produce, everything that we've put our efforts in throughout the year, and it's now coming to culmination. That's why Sukkot is Zman Simchatenu. We also have Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. I'm not getting into those now. Those are kind of outliers because they're not agricultural. But this, in essence, is what a Moed is. So just to summarize, a Moed is a meeting point in time, which we will revisit every single year again and again and again, and on which we deal with a very specific element, which is part of let's just say, our identity, our national identity, a personal identity, and things like that. So that's a pretty straightforward idea. That being said, Tisha B'Av is also considered Moed. And when I say it's considered a Moed, first of all, I'll show this to you, I'll prove it to you in the text, because when you read Eicha, Lamentations, it says as follows. By the way, when I show the Hebrew, I'm also going to show the English after. Sila chol abirai Adonai bekirbi, kara alai Moed lishbor bachurai. This day of Tisha B'Av is considered to be a Moed. And the Moed, here's the English translation, a time that has been set against me. The Lord in my midst has rejected all my heroes. He has proclaimed a set time against me to crush my young men. This means that Tisha B'Av is a Moed in which we encounter something that recurs again and again in time and in history, but it's one of disaster and tragedy. That is a very difficult concept to deal with, that there is a time in the year in which we are dealing with tragedy. We are dealing with, like, all the bad things happen at this time of year. And that's why traditionally, many things that we avoid doing during the 3 weeks period. There's a very traditional kind of view, is that if you have a court case, do it after the 3 weeks, or don't do anything like bungee jumping or anything risky. Just don't do anything risky during these days, because these are bad times. And this is a very traditional, like, you could say it sounds almost like heebie-jeebie, right? Like, what do you mean? It's just a court case. Yeah, but it's not a good time for the Jews, right? So, very interesting thing that for thousands of years, this is how we've looked at Tisha B'Av. All the bad things are packed up on this time. Now, that being said, what I want to say about Tisha B'Av before we get into our stories is that many people think that, and understandably, that Tisha B'Av is a very sad time. I want to mention that it is not a sad time, and I'll prove it to you, but I'll first show this in terms of the concept of Moed. If there is a Moed, in the Jewish calendar, of course, things begin at night, right? So let's say if tonight is Shabbat, so on Mincha, the last prayer of the previous day, we don't say Tachanun, we don't mourn or do anything to do with mourning. We don't say Avinu Malkeinu, all kinds of things like that. Why? Because it's eve of a holiday, so, cheer up a little bit. So if Pesach would be tonight, then now in Mincha we would not say Tachanun, we would not say Avinu Malkeinu. The same applies for Erev Tisha B'Av. The eve of Tisha B'Av, we act as if it's a holiday in the evening, which is a very strange concept if you use the word holiday, right? Except that holiday is just lost in translation because Moed isn't a holiday. In the Jewish calendar, it's a time that is set aside for something. Pesach, Shavuot, Sukkot, and others. So what is Tisha B'Av set aside for? It's set aside for not sad thing, but rather for encountering the harsh, uncompromised reality of what needs to be. And let me explain that. On Tisha B'Av, we aren't sad because of things that happened. Because rather we engage with what happened as this is the reality. It's a difficult reality. It's a harsh reality. It is painful reality, but it forces us to deal with the underlying issues that led to these tragedies. So if we were to look at it, and we'll re-examine this at the end of the class, but if we want to talk about current events, many people were surprised by the attack of October 7. Many people were not surprised at all. In fact, many people were angry that people were surprised, because how could you not know that this was going to happen? And you can point to the Oslo Accords, you can point to the disengagement, you can point to whatever you want. The point is that we see that there is a reality that is forced upon us, and we have to recognize reality. And Tisha B'Av, in a sense, and with this I'll end this concept of Moed, is the exact opposite of Yom Kippur. Because Yom Kippur is a day of forgiveness. Biblically, God forgave us for the golden calf and granted us the second tablets, right? That's what happened. That's why it's a day of forgiveness. But it's a time of kind of compromise, like, okay, you screwed up, you messed up, but we'll live with that. But on Tisha B'Av, there's no compromises. You need to deal with the issues, and as painful as it is for God, as let's say as a parent to have to force their kids to deal with reality, they have to. This is what needs to be done. And as a parent, of course, we know that's the most difficult thing to do is to teach our kids what needs to be done, even though it's painful. So this is really the perspective of what Tisha B'Av is about. So we mourn. Mourn means acknowledging reality. It doesn't mean moping about it and being sad. It means acknowledging reality and coming to grips with reality. So that being said, that's the introduction. Now let's get into our stories and then see how they help us understand today. And again, every Hebrew or Aramaic that I have, I'm going to show the English and I'm going to paraphrase. This is not a text-heavy class. Okay. So we have a very famous story, which is the story of Kamza and Bar. Kamza, you know, the guy was invited by accident to the party, and then because of a mix-up, he's there and he's kicked out and he's embarrassed, and that whole story. What I want to do is to sidestep the misconceptions about that story, pretend that it doesn't exist, and introduce it once I've introduced the other two stories in which it is told. Once we do that, if you set aside for a moment what you think you know about the Kamza and Bar Kamza story, which I'll introduce from scratch as if you've never heard it before, you're going to see that it means something very different and very important and relevant. And it is not about baseless hatred. It's actually not about sinat chinam, which is a very important concept, but that's not what it's about. So let me put that aside for a moment. I've argued myself blue with people who couldn't hear it. So I'm just going to just put it aside for a moment, put it on the shelf, and let's try to see what the story is by the merits of the person telling the story. So the story is, the author is Rabbi Yochanan. It's a very long piece. It's like 3 pages of Talmud in Gittin in page 56 through 57. There's a lot of stories that are intertwined, but the framework is this. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Mai dichtiv, Ashrei Adam mefached tamid, umakshe libo yipol bara'a. And in English, Rabbi Yochanan said, what is the meaning of that which is written in Proverbs? Happy is the man who fears always, but he who hardens his heart shall fall into mischief. Now, again, a lot of mistranslation here. Like, you can always argue about the translation. I would say mistranslation, but it's one aspect. But it basically says the person who's always concerned about what might be, that is the person who's basically better off than a person who basically is stubborn, who can't really deal with reality. Fine, that's basically a verse in Proverbs. Now, Rabbi Yochanan is now going to expound upon this by bringing you 3 stories, and here it is. So he says as follows. This is the direct continuation. Kamza bar Kamza charuv Yerushalayim, atarnegola v'tarnegolta charuv Tur Malka, ashaka derishpak charuv Beitar. And in English, Jerusalem was destroyed on account of Kamza and Bar. So because of the story of Kamza and Bar, Jerusalem was destroyed. The King's Mountain, Tur Malka, which is, it's not really clear where that is, but it's a large area which has many different towns in it. And it's actually interesting that to discuss where exactly this is, but it's in Israel. That's all that matters, okay? The King's Mountain was destroyed on account of a rooster and a hen. And the city of Beitar was destroyed on account of a shaft from a chariot. Now, this sounds a little bit silly, and that's kind of the point. Okay, so let's get into these three stories. Okay, so Rabbi Yochanan is coming to explain this verse from Proverbs. What does it mean if you're always concerned about what might be? You're better off than being stubborn. Okay, three examples of tragic outcomes over something very, very small, and he explains Jerusalem and then Tur Malka, which is the King's Mountain, and Beitar. Now, these three cities. Beitar was destroyed in the Bar Kokhba revolt. Jerusalem is 65 years earlier. It's not even clear when these events necessarily happened, and it doesn't really matter. What matters is the pattern of what do the three have in common. So let's get into the story. So here's the three stories. The first story is actually Jerusalem, but I think it would be more beneficial to discuss Jerusalem last, because then you'll see the pattern better. So let's start from Tur Malka. Okay, what's the story of Tur Malka? So the story about a chicken and a hen. What's the story? So the story goes like this: in the region of Tur Malka, which is a very large area somewhere in ancient Israel, there was this custom for basically at a wedding, right? Just like you have kids today throwing confetti, flowers, walking before the bride and groom, Chatan Kala. It's very cute. They would have a chicken and a hen walk before them. Why? It's a symbol. May you be multiply and fruitful and multiply like chickens. Okay, that was considered a compliment at the time. Okay, so that being said, a Roman garrison, walks through town. A bunch of Roman soldiers. They go through town, and they're a little bit hungry. And while this wedding is happening and the chickens are there ahead, I guess they didn't really understand what's happening or didn't really care too much. They grabbed the chicken, the rooster and the hen, and barbecued them and sat to eat. Now, the people at the wedding were furious. And imagine the peasants of the town coming out with their pitchforks. They basically pursued the Romans, attacked them, and the Romans are like, what is going on? Like, what just happened? Right now, it's a longer story. Obviously, it wasn't. I'm shortening it because there's a lot to discuss. There's like one of these goons. They were like able to kick them 100 yards away. I mean, it's like an exaggeration, but basically they had this like Samson character there who beat up all the Romans, and they sent Romans again, and there was a whole story. But at the end of the day, the city of Tur Malka, or this part of it's an entire, it's a district. In other words, the whole place was destroyed. But while it was being destroyed, on the other side of the hill, there were other weddings going on. They didn't even know this was happening. That's how big the area is. That's just part of the district description in the Talmud. Okay, so that's the story. It's a cute wedding custom that was sort of ruined by these hungry Romans who just passed through, and the result was the destruction of the city. Okay, that's story number one. Now let's go into story number two. So story number two. So we're back to our three stories. We've seen Tur Malka. Before we get to Jerusalem, let's talk about the fall of Beitar. Now, the city of Beitar, whether we're talking about the ultimate destruction in the time of Bar Kokhba or an earlier destruction in the time of the Great Revolt, it doesn't really matter in the story. It's also not quite clear. But what we're trying to do is see what is the picture. So what is this about a branch and a chariot? What exactly is the story? So the story goes like this. One of the Roman governor's daughter is passing through the city of Beitar, maybe on the valley down below. Who knows? She's passing by. Now, her car broke down. Her tire went flat. Her wheel broke. What do? This is the daughter of the governor. You got to do something. So the Roman soldiers chopped down a tree and built her a wheel on the spot, and fixed the carriage. Great. What could possibly go wrong? Well, there was this beautiful custom amongst the people of this town of Beitar, which is probably happening at the time, which is when a boy and girl are born, you plant a tree this kind of tree for a girl, that kind of tree for a boy. And when they grow up, whoever it is that they may marry, you probably knew in advance where they were going to marry. We're talking about ancient times, small villages, yeah? You would make a chuppah out of a canopy out of the wood from those trees, or maybe they'd get married under the tree. I don't exactly know how they would do it. It was a very sweet kind of connection to nature custom. Beautiful. Now, little did these Roman soldiers know that was the tree they cut down. So the people of the village went berserk and they attacked them. Now, you have to imagine the scenario. You have a broken down vehicle of the royal family who's ruling Judea on behalf of the Roman Empire, and they're being attacked. What do you think is going on? Right? Well, if I'm a Roman soldier, they're rebelling, they're trying to attack the princess, or what are we going to do? So basically they contact the governor or the empire, and they come in and simply destroy the city of Beitar. Now, it seems like this is kind of a ridiculous story, right? But now that we've seen two ridiculous stories of a small misunderstanding that blew out of proportion, right? Now let's visit the Kamza and Bar Kamza story. So now that we've seen the second and third story, we're going to go now to the first story, which is the order in which it's shown, and examine that story from this perspective. Okay. So the story, of course, we all know the story. I'm going to be a little bit brief on the text. It's a very famous story. The story is that there was a guy named Kamza who was friendly with this guy, this aristocrat from Jerusalem, who was hosting a big feast. And the valet went out to send invitations, and he accidentally gave the invitation to Bar Kamza, which is a close enough name. You can see, like, maybe they mixed up, they put Kamza-Bar, whatever. He mixed up the names. And Bar Kamza shows up at this feast. Okay, so Bar Kamza shows up at the feast. Now the owner is walking around, making small talk with everybody, and he sees his arch nemesis, Bar Kamza, sitting there. And suddenly, like, the music goes silent, and everybody's noticing this embarrassing moment. He goes, "What are you doing here?" He's like, "What do you mean? You sent me an invitation." It's like, "No, I didn't. Get out of here." So this is a very humiliating situation. Now, apparently Bar Kamza was a man of means as well, and he says, "Listen, how about you let me stay, and I'll pay for my meal." The guy says, "Get out." So he says, "How about I'll pay for half of all of your expenses for this meal. Just let me stay." The guy will not have it. "Get out." Everybody's sitting and watching. He says, "I'll pay for the whole thing. Just let me stay." He's kicked out of there embarrassingly. Now, I'll mention that there is an addendum to the story at the very end of like another 3 or 5 stories that are sort of in between before we get to the next story that say, come and see how important a person's dignity is, because this person was publicly humiliated. Even God was on his side. Okay? So I'm acknowledging his humiliation. When he was at the feast, he realized, listen, all the leaders of the Jews are here. All the rabbis are here. Nobody stood up for me. I'll show them. So he comes up with some kind of brilliant plan to get the Jews. And this is a very long story. He goes to Nero. Nero sends Vespasian. They shoot an arrow to see Jerusalem as whatever. I'm not getting into all the details, but you can, of course, read the full story. Read the full story in the Talmud. So what he does is he goes to the Roman emperor, and he says to the Roman emperor, the Jews have rebelled against you. How will I know that the Jews rebelled? Now, in the Roman world, it was customary to bring offerings, or you can say sacrifices, offerings in whatever way you worship your God in your country in honor of the Roman Empire. So, for example, if you've been to the Met in New York City and you see the Temple of Dendur, this massive temple that's one of, I think, 2 temples that exist outside of Egypt. One of them is in Spain. It was basically brought into New York after it was flooded by the Nile when they built a dam. So that's in Central Park. It's in the Met. That is actually a Roman temple from the year 15, Common Era, which was built in honor of Emperor Augustus. And the offerings were done there in a completely Egyptian style in honor of the emperor. That was expected of every different culture. The Romans were pretty tolerant about different cultures, religions. So the Jews would have to bring an offering in honor of the empire. So he said, bring an offering in honor of His Majesty, and let's see what happens. Now, the assumption is that if the Jews refuse to accept this animal as an offering, then that is a sign that they're planning a rebellion, or they're rebelling. That's all. So Bar Kamza manages to infiltrate into this process, and he takes the animal and he scratches it in the eye in a very subtle way that only nitpicky Jews would be able to even notice. The Romans wouldn't pay attention to that detail. They'd say, nah, this thing is quality, top of the line goat. It can be brought to the temple, because you only bring a beautiful goat to the temple. And they bring the goat to the temple, and Bar Kamza is there. And now the rabbis, the priests, the leaders that are there at the temple realize exactly what's going on. They check the goat. They see it's Bar Kamza. This was yesterday's news. They know exactly what happened, right? They realize they've been set up. What do you do in this situation? It's kind of like a catch, like a damned if you do, damned if you don't. What do you do? So they gather together, and what's important to recognize is one guy's name. His name is Rabbi Zechariah ben Avkulas, or Akilas. I think he's mentioned once in some Roman source. I didn't have the time to brush up on exactly where it is, but he's mentioned only once in Jewish sources aside from this, and he's mentioned somewhere in some Roman source. He's kind of an interesting character. Anyway, he basically puts his foot down and decides what needs to be done without really listening to what everybody else is saying. Okay, so let's hear what everybody else is saying. So they're saying like this: listen, we should accept the animal anyway, because otherwise we'll be in trouble with the empire. Rabbi Zechariah ben Avkulas is a very righteous man. He really cares about the high standard of bringing offerings to the temple. So he says, yeah, but if you do that, people will assume it is permitted to offer an animal with a blemish. Now, what's a blemish? What qualifies as a blemish? Most of us today have no clue what he's talking about. It's so not relevant to where we live today. But he was really adamant about this. So they say, okay, I hear what you're saying. So what if we get rid of Bar Kamza so that he doesn't go and squeal to the empire and get us all killed? In other words, make him disappear, right? So that sounds like a pretty, understanding who you're dealing with. And I want to just pause it for a moment and say, if this is how they're talking about Bar Kamza, I would assume that they know the character and they realize that this person is willing to jeopardize the entire Jewish people because of his personal, let's just say, honor, respect, humiliation, which is, we can understand him being humiliated. It's a big deal. But to be willing to destroy the entire country and all of your people because of that, that tells you a little bit about the person. So if we know a little bit about this person's character, we can understand a little bit about why they didn't even stand up for him, which may or may not have been the right thing to do, but we get a glimpse into what kind of person this is. Okay? Now, so Rabbi Zechariah ben Avkulas finally says, if you kill him, if you do that, people will assume that there is a death penalty for if you bring an animal with a blemish to the altar. Now, what is going on here? Is this guy making any sense? He's kind of making sense a little bit, from this perspective of the introduction of the story, which is Rabbi Yochanan saying, happy is the person who's always worried about what might be, because if you're too stubborn, you'll get in trouble. Well, he seems to be worried about what people will think if you bring an offering, an animal that has a blemish, or he's really, really pious and concerned about that. Now, what I want to point out here is that the author of the story jumps in here. He doesn't do that with the other two stories, and he tells you what the focus of the story is. And here it is, okay? Amar Rabbi Yochanan, again, I'll do this in English right after this. ענוותנותו של רבי זכריה בן אבקולס החריבה את ביתנו ושרפה את היכלנו והגליתנו מארצנו. Said Rabbi Yochanan, the excessive humility or piousness of Rabbi Zechariah ben Avkulas destroyed our temple, burned our sanctuary, and exiled us from our land. Now, that's heavy. That is very, very heavy. But what's important here is that the author of the story is making sure you don't get confused and don't focus on what happened at the party, which he does deal with later in terms of humiliation, right? He talks about that. But the focus is on Rabbi Zechariah ben Avkulas and his piousness. He's the villain in the story. Bar Kamza is sort of like the background to the story. Okay? That being said, let's look at the three pictures from an air view, an aerial view. Let's look at them from the top. What is the pattern of these three stories? The simplest pattern, which we knew from the outset, is a small little thing led to a huge disaster, right? And then we examine what each small silly thing was, whether it's a broken down wagon or a chicken or the laws of blemishes, okay? However, there seems to be a pattern that the people who brought the destruction upon themselves, which is us, didn't see the picture. They simply can't see what the picture is. And we have one more story to sharpen this, but I think that is very, very relevant to where we are today. And I'm going to use the Kamza Bar Kamza misunderstanding as an example for that. Because there is a separate, very important source in the Talmud, in Chazal, that says that the second temple was destroyed because of Sinat Chinam. So people tend to couple these two stories together, and sort of it's become such a habit that we don't even think about it. We just assume it's there. But if you really read the story carefully, as we did now, it's not even hinted there anywhere, nowhere to be found. But what the story does seem to be about is about people not seeing the picture. So they get caught up in these stupidities that lead to tremendous disaster. Now, the fact is that we were right before the war of the attack of Simchat Torah of October 7. We were on the verge of civil war because of issues that have to do with the judicial reform, right? There were people protesting for the judicial reform, people protesting against the judicial reform, and then people trying to make a song of like, bring all the pop stars together to make like a popular song and talk about unity and think, let's just hug it all away and be nice and we'll find a compromise in between. And the truth is that when we focus on sinat chinam, on baseless hatred, and say, okay, so we're hating each other, so what's the solution to that? Let's simply have baseless love for each other. We're just going to hug each other and it'll solve itself, right? And I know that this is a very loaded topic. What I want to say is that based on this story, that is not the focus. You can't solve these different hatreds and divisions within Am Yisrael, within the people of Israel, by saying, let's just hug each other and kumbaya and everything will be fine, right? That's not what the issue is. The real issue is, are we asking the right questions? Are we actually seeing reality? Are we seeing the picture? Or are we caught up in the conviction that we have it all right? Whether it's this custom is so important to have the chickens walk before the bride and groom that we're willing to fight against the Romans before it, or are we willing to burn the country just to get our way one way or another? Either way, it's about being stuck and not actually seeing the picture. And I would like to actually end with a shocking story that is brought in the context of these stories. It's sort of like woven into them to exacerbate the point, to bring it out. And that is the incredible story of Marta bat Boethus. Marta bat Boethus is an aristocrat. She's a wealthy Jewish woman who lives in Jerusalem. She has servants. And during the famine, that was perhaps, we're talking about the famine leading up to the destruction of the temple and the Great Revolt, right? So I would assume that that's the case. It makes sense. So she sends out her servant to go and get her some fine flour from the marketplace. So he goes to the marketplace and he cannot find any fine flour. Now, there's a lot of other things in the marketplace, but he simply ignores them because he knows that if he brings anything else but the finest flour to his mistress, she will be really, really angry at him. So she goes back and she says, sorry, miss, we are out of white flour. They had none. Now, this picture, of course, is a comical picture that came up with AI, and I couldn't get the one with the flour. We'll just go with it, okay? So he goes to her. There was no white flour. So she goes, No white flour? What are you talking about? No white flour? Okay, so how about go get me just regular flour? So he goes out and the same thing happens. By the time he gets back to the marketplace, remember there's a famine. It's all bought up. There's no more ordinary flour. So he goes back to his mistress and same story. So she says, "How about some coarse flour? You know, that stuff from Whole Foods that they think is human food. Go and get that." Same story again. He goes, by the time he gets back to the marketplace, they're completely out of coarse flour. So he goes back and he says, "There's no coarse flour." And she's completely shocked. How could this possibly be? Why don't you go ahead and get some barley flour? He goes back. By the time he gets back, it's all sold out. Now, before we conclude the story, let's try to get into the mindset of this insane story, okay? Like, it's a famine. Don't you realize that people are buying anything that they can get? How could you possibly not just understand that and say, just get me anything? Like, why doesn't he put two and two together? Is he stupid? Well, not necessarily. What if you were in her position? And it was the same kind of situation, right? The food is like it's COVID. Everybody's buying up all the toilet paper. There's nothing left in the shops. All that's left in the shop is some cat food in cans on the corner. And you need to buy food. Would it have occurred to you for a minute to buy cat food? Probably not, right? For her, ordinary flour is cat food. I only eat the finest. Less than that does not touch my mouth. How could you even the audacity to even suggest that I should contemplate having ordinary flour? Well, ma'am, the situation is really bad. There is nothing to eat. People are hungry in the streets. It's really that bad out there somewhere outside my ivory tower? Okay. So go and get white flour. Every single step of the way for her is a crushing reality that the world is not the place she thought it is. It's too much to bear. She can't contemplate. Like, what do you mean there's nothing to eat? What, you want to bring me cat food? It's at a certain point she just loses it. She storms out the door and says, "I'm gonna just go and get it myself. You can't do anything on your own here. You have to rely on yourself." So she leaves her ivory tower to the dirty, hunger-ridden streets of Jerusalem where the sanitation hasn't cleaned in a long time. The Romans are outside, and she walks outside and steps into a pile of dung, which AI said is an inappropriate picture, so I just said stepping in mud, and this worked, okay? She steps into a pile of dung and dies of shock. She dies of shock. Now, how could that possibly be? I mean, it's kind of disgusting to step into something like that in the street, but if it happened to you or me, I don't think you would have died of shock. You'd just be like, this is really, really nasty. Right? I mean, I think you know that if you live in New York, you know why many of the apartments, those brownstones, are with stairs going up. Because before the cars, the automobiles, it was horses everywhere and you couldn't walk in the street. That was just common, right? To this woman, Marta Boethus, Jerusalem was such a utopian place. It's the city of light. It's the city of beauty. Dung in the street is unfathomable. And for her, after going through 4 steps of accepting reality that was too much for her, right, with what kind of flour is available, this was just one step, no pun intended, too many. One step too many. She just could not handle the truth, right? In the words of Jack Nicholson in A Few Good Men, she could not handle the truth. It was simply too much for her to deal with. So that being said, now let's sort of put it all together. Marta Boethus is one story, one of several stories that are intertwined here, but it really sharpens the story of people who can't see reality. They simply don't see what is happening. So if we look at these 3 pictures from above, and now we try to deal with where we are today, the question is, what is really going on? What is the picture? And really, like what Tisha B'Av is about, it's a day of uncompromising reality. It's a day in which God is saying, I'm unforgiving on this day, not because I'm cruel and because I'm sinister and because I'm sadistic, but because I care about you too much to let it go. You're going to have to confront what is really happening, and you're going to have to figure it out. You're going to have to deal with it. And if this is the price, as painful as it is, then I'm going to do it. I'm going to pull the trigger, which is a painful thing. Nobody believed God would do it, right? As the Lamentations express this idea, it's like, we didn't believe you were actually going to do the things that you said in the covenant. We thought they're there kind of as an idea, but not that you're actually going to pull the trigger, right? But like, no, because I cannot compromise, because this is the only way for you to fulfill your destiny, like express yourself fully, to be who you are. So if we look at the story and we look at where we are today, I believe that this story is as a profoundly relevant message because of the tremendous disaster that can come when we cannot see the picture. And everybody is convinced that they see the picture and the other person has it wrong. And that itself begs the question of, what if I'm wrong? Like, should I at least give them the benefit of the doubt? What is actually going on? And the more surprised we are by what happened on October 7th, or what's happening in the world, what's happening in college campuses, what's happening all over the world in the Olympics, like, the more shocked we are, the more we should ask ourselves, am I actually seeing the picture, or am I missing something? Right? It's a very uncomfortable question. It's a challenging question. It's a difficult question. And at the end of the day, this is the question that Tisha B'Av is really about. It's about dealing with reality without compromise and really engaging in what it is. So to summarize this, I hope that this has been a valuable perspective and something that we can take forward, even though it's not a solution, but it's a pathway to a solution. To ask ourselves, are we asking the right questions? What am I missing? What have I not taken into consideration that will lead me the wrong path? Because you can be like a Bizchar ben Avkulas, who's like, this is such a value that we have to fight for this. And really, I don't want to be judgmental about any particular, view. I'm just saying, like, some people, I'm just throwing out there some random ones, whether it's, going up to the Temple Mount and praying yes or no, whether it's drafting Haredim or not, like all these different things. Everybody is fighting each other tooth and nail because we're convinced that this is the right way, and everybody's convinced that's the right way. And the solution to that is not just to hug it away and kumbaya and sing We Are One. That's not going to solve the issues. It's very nice to hope for that, and obviously I would love for that to be the case, but it doesn't deal with the issues. And what are the questions that we have to ask to really deal with the issues, so that next year, when we come to Tisha B'Av, it will be again a set time of uncompromising reality, of truth, but a beautiful truth in which it all comes together, and we can actually celebrate it because we see the world, we see reality, and we take the actions necessary to make this world a place that it could be.